The Outward Urge, written by John Wyndham. 1. The Space Station. A.D. 1994. Narrated by Dorji Swallow. Ticker Troon emerged from his final interview filled with an emulsion of astonishment, elation, respect, and conviction that he needed refreshment. The interview had begun formally, as he had expected. Announced by the clerk, he had marched in smartly and come to attention before the wide desk. The old boy behind it had turned out to be a considerably older boy than he had been prepared for, but his type was authentic. Lean, he was, with a handsome, slightly weathered, aristocratic face, carefully trimmed hair that was quite white, and rows of ribbons on his left breast. He had raised his eyes from a clipful of forms to inspect his visitor carefully, and even at that point, Ticker had begun to have a suspicion that the interview was not going to be entirely routine. For the old boy, or to identify him more fully, Air Marshal Sir Godfrey Wilde, did not employ simply that keen-eyed air of summing one's man up at leisure and appearing incompletely satisfied, which had been the drill at lower grades of interviews. He was really looking at Ticker as a person, and somewhat oddly too. Still looking, he nodded slowly to himself 2 or 3 times. "Troon," he said reflectively. "Flight Lieutenant George Montgomery Troon. Very probably known in some circles, I suspect, as Ticker Troon." Ticker had been startled. Yes, sir." The old boy smiled a little. "The young are seldom very original, G.M. Troon. GMT, hence, deviously Ticker." He had gone on regarding Ticker steadily, with a length of inspection that passed the bounds of custom and of comfort. Ticker grew embarrassed and had to resist the temptation to shift uneasily. The old boy became aware of the awkwardness. His face relaxed into a smile that was friendly and reassuring. "Forgive me, my boy. I was 50 years away," he said. He glanced down at the forms. Ticker recognized some of them. His whole history was there. Troon, GM, age 24, single, C of E, parentage, education, service details, medical report, CO's report, security report no doubt, probably a private life report, notes on friends and so on and so on. Quite a bundle of stuff altogether. The old boy evidently thought so too, for he pushed it all aside with a touch of impatience, waved his hand at an easy chair and slid over a silver cigarette box. "Sit down there, my boy," he invited. "Thank you, sir," Ticker had said, and he had taken the offered cigarette, doing his best to give an impression of ease. "Tell me," said the old boy in a friendly tone, "what made you apply for transfer from air to space?" It was an expected, standard question, to which there was a standard answer, but it was not put in the standard way, and with the man's eye thoughtfully upon him, Ticker decided against giving the standard reply. He frowned, a little uncertainly. "It isn't easy to explain, sir. In fact, I'm not honestly sure that I know. It isn't that I had to do it, but there is a kind of inevitable feeling about it, as if it were a thing I was bound to do sooner or later. My natural next step," "Next step," repeated the Air Marshal. "Not your crowning ambition, then? Next step towards what?" "I don't really know, sir. Outwards, I think. There's a sort of sense I can't explain, a kind of urge onwards and outwards. It is not a sudden idea, sir. It seems always to have been there, at the back of my mind. I'm afraid it all sounds a bit vague." He let himself trail off inadequately, but the old boy did not seem to find it inadequate. He gave a couple of his slow nods and leant back in his chair. For a few moments he gazed up at the cornice of the ceiling, seeming to search his memory. Presently he said, "For all the night, I heard their thin gnat voices cry, star to faint star, across the sky." He brought his gaze down to Ticker's surprised face. "That mean anything to you?" he asked. Hesitantly, Ticker said, "I think so, sir. Where does it come from?" "I was told it was Rupert Brooke, though I've never found the context. But the man I first heard it from was your grandfather." My grandfather, sir?" Ticker stared. "Yes, the other George Montgomery Troon. And does it surprise you to know that he was Ticker Troon too? Grandfather." He shook his head ruefully. "It always seems to be a word for old fellows like me. But Ticker, well, he never had the chance. He was dead, you know, before he was your age." "Yes, sir. Did you know him well?" "I did indeed. We were in the same squadron when it happened. You look amazingly like him. I was expecting you, of course. Nevertheless, it gave me quite a shock when you came in." The air marshal had paused at that, somewhat lengthily. Then he went on. "He had that feeling too. He flew because that was as far outwards as we could get in those days, as far as most of us ever expected to get. But not Ticker. I can remember even now the way he used to look up at the night sky, at the moon and the stars, and talk about them as if it were a foregone conclusion that we'd be going out there someday. And sadly, too, because he knew that he'd never be going out there himself. We used to think it comic strip stuff in those days, but he'd smile off the ragging and the arguments as if he just knew." There had been another long pause then, before he added, "God, I'm sorry old Ticker can't know about this. If there's one thing that'd make him as pleased as Punch, it'd be to know that his grandson wants to go out there." "Thank you, sir. It's good to know that," Ticker had told him. And then, feeling that the ball had been passed to him, he added, "He was killed over Germany, wasn't he, sir?" "Berlin, August 1944, said the air marshal. "A big op. His aircraft blew up." He sighed reminiscently. "When we got back, I went to see his wife, your grandmother. She was a lovely girl, a sweet girl. She took it hard. She went away somewhere, and I lost touch with her. She is still alive?" "Very much so, sir. She married again in, I think, 1949? "I'm glad of that. Poor girl. They were only married a week before he was killed, you know." "Only a week, sir? I didn't know it was as short as that." "It was. So your father, and consequently yourself, may be said to exist at all only by a very narrow margin. They had married a little earlier than they intended. Perhaps Ticker had a premonition. Most of us did, though some of us were wrong." There was another pause which lasted until the air marshal roused himself from his thoughts to say, "You have stated here that you are single." "Yes, sir," agreed Ticker. He became abruptly conscious of the special license in his pocket, and all but looked down to see if it were protruding. "That was a condition of application, of course," said the old man. "Are you, in fact, unmarried?" "Yes, sir," Ticker said again, with an uneasy feeling that the pocket might have become transparent. "And you have no brother?" "No, sir," the air marshal remarked consideringly. "The stated purpose of this qualification is at variance with my experience. I have never found in war that the married officer is less redoubtable than the single man. Rather the other way, in fact. One is led to suspect, therefore, that the matter of pensions and subsequent responsibilities is allowed inappropriate weight. Would you say that it is a good principle that our fittest young men should not infrequently be dissuaded from procreation while the less fit retain the liberty to breed like rabbits?" No, sir," Ticker said wonderingly. "Good," said the air marshal. "I am very glad to hear it." He maintained such a steady regard that Ticker was all but impelled to confess the presence of the license. Prudence, however, still kept a fingertip hold on him. When the old boy had spoken again, It was to turn the interview on to more conventional lines. "You understand the need for top security in this work?" he inquired. Ticker felt easier. "Security has been very much stressed all along, sir." "But you don't know why?" "I've been given no details, sir." "Nevertheless, as an intelligent young man, you must have formed some ideas." "Well, sir, from what I have heard and read about experimental space missiles, I should think the time can't be far off now when we shall start to build some kind of space station, possibly a manned satellite. Would it be something of that sort?" "It would indeed, my boy. Though your deductions are not quite up to date, I'm glad to say. The space station already exists, in parts, and some of the parts are already up there. Your job will be to help in the assembly." Ticker's eyes widened, lit up with enthusiasm. "I say, sir, that's wonderful. I'd no idea. I thought we were rather behind in this sort of thing. Assembling the first space station." He trailed off incoherently. "I did not say it was the first," the old man reminded him. "In fact, there may be others." Ticker looked shocked. The air marshal amplified. "It doesn't do to take things for granted. After all, we know that the Americans, and the other fellows too, have been working hard on it, and our resources are nothing like theirs." Ticker stared. "I thought we'd be working with the Americans, sir." "So we ought to be. We're certainly not working against them, but it just so happens that our people remember their love of public announcements at politically happy moments, and they remember certain leaks in our security system. Result? We go our different ways, with a great waste of time and energy in duplication of work. On the other hand, it will allow us to stand on our own feet in space, if that expression may be permitted, instead of being taken along as poor relations. That might one day turn out to have its advantages." "I suppose so, sir. And the other fellows?" "Oh, they're at work on it all right. They were known to be working on an unmanned satellite 40 years ago when the Americans stole their thunder by making the first public announcement on satellites. But they got their own back by putting the first one into orbit. Just how far they've got now is a matter on which this department would like a lot more information than it has. Now, as to yourself, first of all, there'll be conditioning and training." Ticker's thoughts were far too chaotic for him to give proper attention to the details that followed. He was looking beyond the walls of the sunlit office and already seeing the fire-pointed blackness of space. In imagination, he could feel himself floating in the void. Abruptly, he became aware that the air marshal had ceased to talk and was looking at him as if after a question. He tried to pull himself together. "I'm awfully sorry, sir. I didn't quite follow." "I can see I'm wasting my time now," the old man had said, but without rancor. Indeed, he had smiled. "I've seen that look before. I think you'll do. But perhaps one day you'll be good enough to explain to me why a troon is habitually thrown into a form of hypnotic trance at the thought of space." He rose. Ticker jumped up quickly. "Remember, the security? This is top secret. The kind of thing you would not even let your wife guess. If, of course, you were so fortunate as to have one. You appreciate that?" "I do, sir." "Goodbye, then, Ticker, and good luck." Ticker had thanked him in a not quite steady voice. Afterwards, in the first convenient saloon bar, a whiskey in front of him, he pulled the special marriage license out of his pocket and considered it again. He wished now that he had not been so carried away, that he had listened with more care to what the old boy had been telling him, something about a conditioning course of 12 weeks and studying the space station, both in plan and mock-up. And something about a bit of leave, too? Could that be right? After all, if they had some of the sections up there already, wouldn't they be about finished by the time he was trained and ready to go? He was momentarily alarmed, until his common sense asserted itself. You couldn't just throw the pieces of a space station up into the sky and let them come together. Every part must be ferried there, laboriously, monotonously, very, very expensively, and in quite small bits at a time. It would be far and away the most costly structure ever built. There would have to be heaven knew how many journeys up there before they had enough to start on the assembly. Thinking of only that aspect of the problem caused him to swing gloomily to the other extreme. Why? It was more likely to take years and years before it could be fully assembled and in working order. He dredged around his mind for what the old boy had said about spells of duty. 4 weeks on, 4 weeks off. Though that was hypothetical at present, and might need modification in the light of experience. All the same, the intention sounded generous enough. Not bad at all. He returned his attention to the marriage license in his hand. There could be no doubt that from an official point of view, no such document should exist. On the other hand, if an air marshal chose to reveal clearly what he thought of the ban, with such eminence on his side, even though unofficially, well, why delay? He'd got the job. He folded the paper carefully and restored it to his pocket. Then he strode purposefully to the telephone box. Ticker, standing in the mess room of the Hulk and gazing out of the window, took his breakfast gloomily. The Hulk, as it had become known, even on official memos, was the one habitable spot in thousands of miles of nothing. It was the local office of works, and also the hostel for the men serving their tour of duty. Down its shadow side, windows ran almost the full length, giving a view of the assembly area. The few ports to the sunward were kept shuttered. On the outer sun side of the hull was mounted a ring of parabolic reflectors, none more than a foot across, and all precisely angled. When the eye of the sun shone full in the center of the ring, they were inactive, but it never did for long, and a variation of a degree or two would bring one or other of the reflectors into focus, collecting intense heat. Presently, a small, invisible explosion of steam would correct the error by its recoil, and slowly the Hulk would swing a little until another reflector came into focus and gave another correction. It went on all the time, save for the brief nights in the Earth's shadow, so that the view from the leeward windows never altered. It was always the space station assembly. Ticker broke a roll, still warm from the oven operated by a large reflector on the sun side. He left the larger part of it hanging in the air while he buttered the lesser. He munched absent-mindedly and took a jet of hot coffee. Then he relinquished the plastic coffee bottle and let it float while he reached back the rest of the roll before it could waft further. All these actions he performed without conscious thought. They had quickly ceased to be novelties and become part of the natural background conditions to one's tour of duty, so customary that it was rather a propensity to poise things conveniently in mid-air when one was at home on leave that had to be checked. Munching his roll, Ticker continued to regard the view with distaste. However enthusiastic one might be about the project as a whole, a sense of ennui and impatience to be away inevitably set in during the last few days of a spell. It had been so on the verge of his 5 previous leaves, and this time, for special reasons, it was more pronounced. Outside, the curve of the Earth made a backdrop to half the window's span, though there was no telling which continent faced him at the moment. Cloud hid the surface and diffused the light as it did most of the time, so that he seemed to be looking not at a world, but at a segment of a huge pearl resting in a bed of utter blackness. As a foreground, there was the familiar jumble of work in progress. The main framework of the station had already been welded together, a wheel-like cage of lattice girders, 140 feet in diameter, and 24 feet thick. It sparkled in the unobstructed sunlight with a harsh, silver glitter that was trying to the eyes. A few panels of the plating were already fixed, and small, bulbous-looking figures in spacesuits were maneuvering more sheets of metal into positions within the framework. The littered, chaotic impression of the whole scene was enhanced by the web of lines which crisscrossed it. Safety lines and mooring lines ran in every direction. There was a dozen or more from the hulk to the main assembly, and no single component section or instrument was without a tether to fasten it to some other. None of the lines was taut. If one became so, it remained like that for no more than a second or two. Most of them were continually moving in loops, like lazy snakes. Others just hung, with barely perceptible motion. Every now and then, one of the workers on the framework would pause as a case or an item of the structure as yet unused came nuzzling gently at the girders. He would give it a slight shove, and it would drift away again, its cable coiling in slow motion behind it. A large cylinder, part of the atmosphere regenerating plant, swam into Ticker's view on its way from the hulk to the assembly. The space-suited man who was ferrying it over had hooked himself to it and was directing their mutual slow progress by occasional, carefully aimed blasts from a wide-mouthed pistol. He and his charge were floating free in space, but for his thin lifeline undulating back to the hulk. There was no sense whatever that all this was taking place as they hurtled round the Earth at a speed of thousands of miles per hour. One was no more aware of it than one was of the pace at which the Earth hurtles round the sun. Ticker paused in his eating to appreciate the skill of the pistol user. It looked easy, but everyone who had ever tried it knew that it was a great deal easier to set oneself and the load spinning giddily all ways over. That did not happen so often now that the really ham-handed had been weeded out. But a little misjudgment could start it in a moment. He grunted approval and went on eating and reflecting. 4 days now. 4 more days and he would be back home again. And how many spells before it would be finished, he wondered. They were holding a sweep on that, with quite a nice prize. The schedules drawn up in comfortable offices back on Earth had gone to pieces at once. In real experience of the conditions, progress with the earlier stages had been a great deal slower than the estimates had reckoned. Tricks, techniques, and devices had to be evolved to meet difficulties that the most careful consideration had overlooked. There had also been 2 bad hold-ups. One, because someone in logistics had made a crass error in the order of dispatch. The other, on account of a parcel of girders that had never arrived, and was now presumably circling the Earth as a lonely satellite on its own account, if it had not shot away into space. Working in weightless conditions had also been more troublesome than they had expected. It was true that objects of great bulk and solidity could be shifted by a touch, so that mechanical handling was unnecessary, but on the other hand, there was always the equal and opposite reaction to be considered and dealt with. One was forever seeking anchorage and purchase before any force whatever could be applied. The lifetime habit of depending on one's weight was only slightly less than an instinct. The mind went on assuming that weight, just as it went on trying to think in terms of up and down until it had been called to order innumerable times. Ticker left off watching the guided drift of the cylinder and took a final jet of coffee. He looked at the clock. Still half an hour to go before the shift changed, 20 minutes before he need start getting into his spacesuit and testing it. He lit a cigarette, and because there was nothing else to do, found himself moodily contemplating the scene outside once more. The cigarette was half finished when the ship's speaker system grated and announced, "Mr. Troon, please call at the radio cabin. Radio message for Mr. Troon, please." Ticker stared at the nearest speaker for an apprehensive moment, and then ground out the remains of his cigarette against the metal wall. With a clicking and scraping of magnetic soles, he made his way out of the mess room. In the passage, he disregarded the rules, and sent himself scudding along with a shove. He caught the radio cabin's door handle and grounded his feet in one complicated movement. The radio operator looked up. "Quick worker, Ticker. Here you are." He handed over a folded piece of paper. Ticker took it in a hand that irritated him by shaking slightly. The message was brief. It said simply, "Happy birthday, from Laura and Michael." He stood staring at it for some seconds, and then wiped his hand across his forehead. The radio man looked at him thoughtfully. "Funny things happen in space," he remarked. "Must be quite 6 months since you last had a birthday. Many happy returns all the same." Yes, thanks," said Ticker vaguely, and pulled himself out of the cabin. Outside, he stood reading the short message again. Michael, they had decided, if it were a boy, Anna for a girl. But early, by at least a fortnight. Still, what did that matter, except that he had hoped to be on hand? The important thing was happy birthday, which meant both doing well. He became untranced suddenly, and pushed back into the radio cabin. The dressing bell for the next shift went while he was scribbling his reply. A few moments later, he was whizzing down the passage, headed for the suit store. When Ticker's turn came, he stepped to the edge of the open airlock, clipped the eye of his short lead round the guideline, and then, with a two-legged push-off against the side of the hulk, sent himself shooting out along the line towards the assembly. Practice had given all of them a pride in their ability to deal dexterously with the conditions. A quick twist, something like that of a falling cat, brought his feet round to act as buffers at the end of his journey. He unhooked from the guideline and hooked on to a local lifeline, obeying the outside worker's rule number 1, that he should never for a moment work unattached. Then he pushed across to the far side of the frame where assembly was going on. One of the workers there saw him coming and turned his head towards him so that his tight beam radio sounded in Ticker's helmet louder than the all-round reception. "All yours," he said, "and welcome to it. This plate's a bastard." Ticker came up to him. They exchanged lines. "Be seeing ya," said the other, and gave a yank on the line which took him back the way Ticker had come. Ticker shook his new safety line to send it looping out of his way, and turned to give his consideration to the plate that was a bastard. The new shift adjusted their general intercom radios to low power so that they could converse comfortably between themselves. They noticed the progress made since their last spell, compared it with the plan, identified the sections at hand, and started in. Ticker looked his plate over, and then twisted it so that the markings lined up. It was no bastard after all, and slipped quite easily into place. He was not surprised. One got tired and not infrequently a little stupid by the end of a shift. With the plate fixed, he paused, looking out at Earth with his eye shield raised so that he saw it fully, in all its brilliance, a great shimmering globe that filled half the sky. Quite extensive patches here and there were free of cloud now, and through them there was blue. The sea, perhaps, and then again perhaps not, for whenever one saw the surface it looked blue, just as the blackness of space seen from the Earth in daylight looked blue. Somewhere over there, on that great shining ball, he now had a son. The idea came to him as a marvel. He could picture Laura smiling as she held the baby to her. He smiled to himself, and then chuckled. He had smuggled himself a family in spite of the regulations, and if they did find out now, he shrugged. And anyway, he had a well-grounded suspicion that he was not the only family man among his supposedly celibate companions. He did not underestimate the security boys. He simply thought it likely that others beside the air marshal found a blind eye convenient. In just 4 days more, a nudge at his back interrupted him. He turned to find another plate that someone had pushed along for his attention, Gripping a girder between his knees for anchorage, he started to twist it into position. Half an hour later, a tight beam radio voice from the hulk overrode their local conversation. "Unidentified object coming up," it announced, and gave a constellation bearing. The working party's heads turned towards Aries, the great stars flaring there against the multitudinous speckling of the rest looked no different from usual. "Not a dispatch, you mean?" someone asked. "Can't be. We've had none notified." "Meteor?" someone else suggested, with a trace of uneasiness. "We don't think so. There's been a slight change of course since radar picked it up a couple of hours ago. That seems to rule out meteors. Can't you get the telescope on it?" "Only for a glimpse. Damned hulk's hunting too much. We're trying to steady her up." "Could it be that parcel of girders, do you think? The lot that went astray? Couldn't it be that its homing gear has just got the range of us?" "Might be, I suppose," admitted the voice from the hulk. "It's certainly got a line straight on us now. If it is, the proximity gear should stop it and hold it about a couple of miles off. And you'll need to send somebody out with a line to make it fast. Plenty of time to see about that later. We'll keep you informed, once we can get this damned tub steady enough to keep the glass on it." His wave cut off, and the assembly party, after vainly scanning the Aries region again, turned back to their work. Nearly an hour passed before the voice from the hulk spoke once more. "Hello there, assembly," it said, and without waiting for acknowledgement, went on. "There's something damned funny about that thing in Aries. It certainly isn't the girder package. We don't know what it is." "Well, what's it look like?" inquired one of the working party patiently. It's like a large circle, with 3 smaller circles set at thirds around the perimeter." "You don't say." "Well, that's what we see, damn it. The thing's head on to us. The circles may be mile-long cylinders, for all we can tell." Again, the helmeted heads of the working party turned towards Aries. "Can't see anything. Is it blasting?" "There's no sign of blast. It looks as if it's free-falling at us. Just a minute." He broke off. 5 minutes passed before he came in again. This time, his tone was more serious. "We radioed a description to base, asking for info and identification. The reply is just in. It reads, 'No repeat. No dispatch you since number 377K 4 days ago stop. Design of object as described, not repeat, not known here. Stop. Pentagon states, not repeat, not known them. Stop. Consider possible craft, missile, hostile. Stop. Treat as hostile, taking all precautions. Ends.'" For some moments no one spoke. The helmets of the working party turned as they looked at one another in astonishment. "Hostile? For God's sake! Why every bloody thing out there's hostile?" somebody said. "Precautions!" said another voice. "What precautions?" Ticker inquired. "Have we any interception missiles?" "No," said the voice from the hulk. "They're scheduled, but they are away down the fitting out list yet." "Hostile," murmured another voice. "But who? Who do you think? Who'd rather we didn't have a station out here?" "But hostile," the man said again. "It would be an act of war. To attack us, I mean." "Act of nothing," said the second man. "Who even knows we're up here? Except the department, and now, apparently, the other fellows. Say we were attacked and blown up. What'd happen? Sweet damn all. Nothing but hush from both sides. Not even details. Just hush. Everybody seems to be taking a lot for granted, considering that nobody even knows what the thing is," someone pointed out. That, Ticker admitted, was true enough, but somewhat legalistic. For it was difficult to believe that anything could happen to be travelling this particular section of space by sheer accident. And if it were not accidental, then it followed that the intention of any visiting object that did not originate with their department must be either observatory or hostile. He turned his head again, surveying the myriad suns that flared in the blackness. The first comment had been right. It was all hostile. For a moment, he felt that hostility all about him, more keenly than at any time since he had first forced himself to push out of the hulk's airlock into nothingness. His memory of that sensation had been dulled, but now, abruptly, he was the intruder again, the presumptuous creature thrusting out of his natural element, precariously self-launched among a rack of perils. Odd, he thought, in a kind of parentheses, that it should need the suspicion of human hostility to reawaken the sense of the greater hostility constantly about them. He became conscious that the others were still talking. Someone had inquired about the object's speed. The hulk was replying, "Difficult to estimate more than roughly, head-on, but doesn't seem to be high relative to our own. Certainly unlikely to be more than 200 miles an hour difference, we judge. Could well be less. You ought to be able to see it soon. It's starting to catch the Earthlight." There was no sign of it in the Aries sector yet. Somebody said, "Should we get back aboard, Skip?" "No point in it. It wouldn't help at all if that thing does have a homer set on the hulk." "True," agreed someone, and sang gently, "There's no hiding place out here." They went on working, casting occasional glances into the blackness. 10 minutes later, 2 men exclaimed simultaneously. They had caught one small, brief flare among the stardust. "Starboard jet correcting course," said the voice from the hulk. "That settles one thing. It's live, and it is homing on us. Swinging now. It'll recorrect in a moment." They watched intently. Presently, nearly all of them caught a glimpse of the little jet of flame that steadied the object's swing. A man swore, "God damn it! And us here like sitting pigeons. One little guided missile to meet it. That's all that's needed. Pity one of the department's great brains didn't allow for that, isn't it?" "What about an oxygen tube?" someone suggested. "Fix up one of the dispatch homers on it and let it jet itself along till they meet." "Good idea. If we had a day or so to fix the homer," agreed another. Presently, the object caught more of the Earthlight, and they were able to keep its location marked, though not yet able to distinguish its shape. A consultation went on between the leader of the working party and the commander of the hulk. It was decided not to take the party inboard. If the thing were indeed a missile and set to explode on contact, or at close proximity, then the situation would be equally hopeless wherever one was. But should it, on the other hand, fail to explode on contact and simply cause impact damage to the hulk, it might be useful to have the party outside, ready to give what help it could. On that decision, the men in spacesuits started to push themselves off and drift through the web of girders towards the hulkward side of the assembly. There they exchanged their local safety lines for others attached to the hulk and were ready to pull themselves across, if necessary. They waited in an uneasy group, a surrealist cluster of grotesque figures anchored to the framework at eccentric angles by their magnetic souls, while they watched the oncoming object, the craft missile, grow slowly larger. Soon they could distinguish the outline described, 3 small circles set about a larger. It was from the small circles that a correcting puff of flame came now and then. "It's my guess, from the general look of the thing and its slow speed," the hulk commander's voice said, dispassionately, "that it's half missile, half mine, a kind of hunting mine. I'd guess, too, by the way it's aligned on us, that it is a contact type. Might be chemical, or nuclear. Probably chemical. If it were nuclear, a proximity fuse would be good enough. Besides, a nuclear explosion would be detectable from Earth. With a chemical explosion out here, you'd want all the concentration of force you can get, hence contact. No one seemed disposed to question the commander's deductions. There could be no doubt that it was aligned on them. The swinging was so slight that they could see no more than the head-on view. Estimated relative speed about 120 miles an hour, added the commander. Slow, Ticker thought. Very slow. Probably to keep maneuverability in case of evasive action by its target. There was nothing one could do but stand there and wait for it. ETA now, 5 minutes, the voice from the hulk told them calmly. They waited. Ticker found a new understanding of the stringent security regulations. Hitherto, he had taken it for granted that their purpose was to preserve the lead. Clearly, once it should be known that any nation had a space station under construction, those who had it only in the drawing board stage would press on, and the pace would grow warmer. The best way to avoid that was secrecy, and, if necessary, to show astonishment that any such device was being seriously contemplated. That had seemed reasonable. There was nothing to be gained by creating a situation where construction would have to be rushed, and, possibly, a lot might be lost by it. The thought of an attack on the station before it was even finished had never occurred to him. But if this were indeed a missile, and if it should get the hulk, nobody would survive. And if the department were to be stung into denouncing the aggression, well, the other fellows would just shrug and deny. What, us? Why, we never even knew it existed. Obviously an accident, they would say. An accident which has now been followed by a vicious and despicable slander in an effort to cover up those responsible. 3 minutes, said the commander. Ticker took his eyes from the craft missile and looked about him. His gaze loitered on the moon, a clear, sharp coin, recently risen from behind the blue pearl of earth. Scarred but serene, it hung on the sky, a silver medal still waiting to be won. The next leap. First there had been this little hop of 10,000 miles to make a stepping stone for the leap of 224,000 miles, more or less, and then, not in his time, but someday, there would be still greater leaps beyond. For him, for now, the moon would be enough. The moon, murmured Ticker. The moon on the one hand, the dawn on the other. The moon is my sister. The dawn is my brother. Suddenly, he was swept with a shaking anger, a fury against stupidity and littleness, against narrow, scheming minds that were ready to wreck the greatest adventure of all, as a political move. What would happen now if their work were destroyed? The cost had been in proportion to the ambition. If all this were lost, would the government be willing? Could they even afford to make a new allocation and start again? Might it not be that, with such an example, all the rival nations would content themselves with arrangements to blow any other attempted space stations out of existence? Would that be the end of the great adventure, to be kept earthbound by stalemate and futility? 2 minutes, said the voice. Ticker looked at the missile again. It was swinging a little more now, enough to give glimpses of length instead of a flat diagram of circles. He watched it curiously. There was no doubt that the roving action was increasing. Correction and recorrection were stronger and more frequent. "What's happening to the bastard?" a voice asked. "Kind of losing its touch, isn't it?" They stared at it in horrid fascination, watching the yawing motion grow wider while the correcting jet spat more fiercely and rapidly. Soon, it was swinging so much that they were getting broadside views of it. A fat, droplet-shaped body, buttressed by 3 smaller droplet shapes which housed its driving tubes. The small correcting tubes, so busily employed at this moment, branched laterally in radial clumps from the main tube nacelles. Its method of working was obvious. Once the homing device had found a line on the target, the main tubes would fire to give directional impetus. Then, either to keep down to maneuverable speed, or simply to economize, they would cut out, leaving it to coast easily to the target while the homer kept it on course by correcting touches from the side tubes. Less obvious was what had got into it now, and was causing it to bear down on them in a wildly drunken wobble. "Why the devil should it go nuts and start hunting at this stage?" muttered the leader of the working party. "That's it," said the commander from the hulk, with a sudden hopeful note in his voice. "It has gone nuts, all bewitched and bewildered. It's the masses, don't you see? The mass of the hulk is about the same as that of the assembly in parts now. The thing is approaching on a line where they are both equidistant. Its computers are foozled. They can't decide which to go for. It would be bloody funny if it weren't serious. If it can't decide in another few seconds at that speed, it'll overshoot any possibility of correcting in time." They kept watching the thing tensely. It had, in fact, already lost a little speed, for it was now yawing so widely that the steering tube's attempts to correct the swing were having some braking effect. For a half-minute there was silence. Then someone breathed out noisily. "He's right, by God! It is going to miss," he said. Other held breaths were released, and the earphones sounded a huge, composite sigh of relief. It was no longer possible to doubt that the missile would pass right between the hulk and the assembly. In a final, desperate effort to steady up, the port tubes fired a salvo that spun it right round on its own axis as it hurtled along. "Bloody thing started waltzing now," observed a voice. Still wobbling wildly, it careered on, in a flaring, soundless rush. Closer it reeled, and closer until it was whirling madly past, between them and the hulk. Ticker did not see what happened next. There was a sudden violent shock which banged his head against the inside of his helmet, and turned everything into dancing lights. For a few seconds he was dazed. Then it came to him that he was no longer holding on to the framework of the assembly. He groped, and found nothing. With an effort he opened his eyes and forced them into focus. The first thing they showed him was the hulk and the half-built space station dwindling rapidly in the distance. Ticker kicked wildly and managed to turn himself round, but it took him several moments to grasp what had happened. He found that he was floating in space in company with a collection of minor parts of the assembly and two other space-suited men, while close by the missile, now encumbered with a tangle of lines, was still firing its steering tubes while it cavorted and spun in an imbecilic fashion. By degrees, he perceived that the missile had, in its passage, managed to entangle itself in a dozen or more tethers and safety lines, and torn them away, together with whatever happened to be attached to them. He closed his eyes for a moment. His head throbbed. He fancied that it was bleeding on the right side. He hoped that the cut was small. If there was much blood, it might float around loose in his helmet and get into his eyes. Suddenly, the commander's voice in the phone said, "Quiet, everyone." It paused, and went on, "Hello? Hello there. Calling you three with the missile. Are you all right? Are you all right?" Ticker ran his tongue over his lips and swallowed. "Hello, Skipper. Ticker here. I'm all right, Skip." "You don't sound so all right, Ticker." "Bit muzzy. Knocked my head on my helmet. Better in a minute." "What about the other two?" A groggy voice broke in. "Nobby here, Skipper. I'm all right too, I think. Been sick as a dog. Not funny at all. Dunno about the other. Who is it?" "Must be Dobbin. Hello there, Dobbin. Are you all right?" There was no reply. "It was a hell of a jerk, Skipper," said the groggy voice. "How's your air?" Ticker looked at the dials. "Normal supply, and reserve intact, he said. My reserve isn't registering. Fractured, maybe, but I've got nearly 4 hours, said Nobby. Better cut loose and make your way back by hand tubes, said the commander. You right away, Nobby. Ticker, you've got more air. Can you reach Dobbin? If you can, link him onto you and bring him back with you. Think you can? Shouldn't be difficult, I think. Look, Skip, Nobby began. That's an order, Nobby, the commander told him briefly. Kicking himself over, Ticker was able to see one of the space-suited figures fumbling at his belt. Presently, the safety line floated free, though the figure still kept along in company. It drew the pistol-like hand tube from the holster and held it in front with both hands, kicking a little as it maneuvered to get the Hulk dead behind it in the tube's mirror sights. Then the tube flared, and the figure holding it dropped away. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed. Be seeing you, Ticker, said its voice. Bacon and eggs? Done both sides, mind, Ticker told him. He drew his own tube. When he had the second space-suited figure in the mirror, he gave the briefest possible touch on the trigger to set himself drifting towards it. A few moments later, he reported, I'm afraid old Dobbin's through, Skip. It was quick, though. Bloody great rip in the left leg of his suit. Damn bad luck. Shall I bring him back? The commander hesitated a moment. No, Ticker, he decided. It'd just mean an additional hazard for you. Dobbin wouldn't want that. No, cast off his line and let him go, poor chap. Take his reserve air bottle, though, and his tube, too. It'll help you catch up on Nobby. There was a brief silence, then, That's funny, Ticker murmured. What's funny? Demanded the commander. Just a minute, Skip. What is it, Ticker? The lines have tightened, Skipper. A minute ago, we and the odd bits were all in a clump, with the missile acting daft alongside. Now, it's steadied up. Seems to be pulling away. Hell, this is confusing. You aren't where you ought to be either. Oh, I get it. The thing's turning, swinging us round after it. I'm letting old Dobbin go now. There was a pause. He's drifting off on a different line, away from me. The thing must be making a wide turn, I think. Difficult to tell just what it is doing. It's giving lots of little bursts as it steadies up. I don't care much for this, Skipper. All the towed bits, including me, have swung together in a jumble. Better cast off now and shove yourself clear. Just a minute, Skip. I want to see. His voice tailed away. Yes, she is. She's pulling steadily round. Ticker was hanging out at the end of his lifeline, watching the constellations wheel slowly and twisting slowly himself, which made it the more confusing. The random element introduced into the missile by the conflict of purpose had been sorted out. It was coordinated again, and its change of direction was steady, smooth and purposeful. It was, in fact, back on the job. Its radar had searched for and found the target it had missed in its temporary derangement, and was bringing it round to bear once more. Somewhere inside the fat metal droplet, there were relays ready to go in once it was steady in the aim. A brief burst on the main tubes would send it back to the attack. My God! Exclaimed Ticker, and began to haul himself hand over hand along his safety line, shoving aside the trailing flotsam of assembly items as he went, and making for the missile itself. What's that about? Haven't you cast off yet? Inquired the commander. Ticker did not reply. He had come close to the missile, swung a little out from it by the continuing turn, but able to reach it. Presently, he could touch it, and brought round a leg to kick himself clear of the steering tubes. He pulled himself forward on the length of line remaining, and caught hold of the member which joined one of the nacelles to the main body. It was round all three of these members that the lines had tangled as the missile had swept past the assembly, and he tied his safety line short to a loop in the tangle that looked as if it would hold. "What the devil are you doing, Ticker?" asked the commander. "I'm aboard the missile, Skipper," Ticker told him. "For heaven's sake! You mean you're on the damn thing? Look, I told you to cast off. Do I have to make it an order?" "I hope you won't, Skipper, because I rather think that if you did, and if I obeyed it, I'd very likely have nowhere to go."
"What do you mean by that?"
"Well, it looks to me as if this thing is in the process of getting round to have another go at you."
"Is it, by hell?"
"You sure of that, Ticker?" "Afraid so. Don't see what else it can be doing. It's certainly making a steady arc, and if that's its game, this seems to be as good a place as any."
"Wouldn't be my choice? What do you mean?"
"Well, if I'd stayed where I was, I'd be fried when it fires its main tubes, and if I cast off now and it does go for you, I stand to die slowly in a spacesuit. Not nice at all. Whereas this way, I get a free ride home. If it misses you, I can roll off. If it doesn't, well, it'll be the same for all of us."
"That's a lot more logical than agreeable. What's it doing now?"
"Still coming round. You lie to port as we go. About 20 degrees more to swing yet. You should be able to observe easily."
"We've got you on the radar, all right, but we can't bring the glass to bear so far to sunward."
"I see. Tried to keep you informed," said Ticker. He worked forward on the metal body. There was enough iron in it to give some traction for his magnetic soles. "Turn still gradual, but steady," he reported. "This thing has a number of knobs and protuberances and so on round the nose," he added. 5 major and several minor. God knows what they are. 1 or more must be radar."
"With limited range, obviously," said the commander. "Must be. Or it would go off chasing the moon or the Earth instead of us.
That looks as if they must know our distance and the plane of our orbit pretty accurately.
Damn them.
Given that, it wouldn't be too difficult to make it sure to find us sooner or later. If you can sort out which is the radar, it might be helpful to have a good bash at it." "Trouble is, they aren't like anything I've ever seen," complained Ticker. "It'd just be too bad if the one I bashed turned out to be a fuse."
"Take your time, and make sure. How's she bearing now?"
"Nearly on. 3 or 4 degrees more." He slid back a bit to a position where he could brace himself on a nacelle member. The intermittent vibration from the starboard tubes ceased, and a new tremor ran through the missile as the port tubes fired to check her. "She's round now," he told the commander. "Lined up on you, and steadying." He waited tensely, gripping with arms and knees as best he could. The main tubes spurted briefly. He felt the missile surge forward. There was a jerk as the lines to the flotsam tightened and checked it. The tubes fired again. The missile and its tow jerked to and fro on their loose coupling, but only one of the lines parted to let a girder section spin off into space on its own. The rest joggled, and the lines looped about until presently the whole conglomeration was in motion on the new line, headed now for the distant hulk, but at a speed somewhat below that of the missile's former attack. "On our way now, Skip," Ticker reported. "I'll get forward again and try to see about that radar." On the nose once more, he tried shielding the protuberances in turn with his gloved hands. There was no apparent effect, certainly no tendency to deviate from the course. He slackened off the lifeline a little and hung over the front to shield as many as possible at once with his body, also without noticeable result. Again, he examined the projections. One of them looked as if it might be a small solar energy cell, but the rest were unidentifiable. He was sure only that some of them must be relaying the information to the controls. He sat back, astride the nose of the missile, and feeling the need of a cigarette as he had seldom felt it before. "Got me beat," he admitted. "I just don't know, Skip. Almost any of them might be any damn thing." He turned his attention to the spangled blackness about him. The hulk and the assembly, lying dead ahead, were shining more brightly than anything but the sun itself. "One thing, Skipper," he said. "It won't be like the other try. The turns brought it round so that you and the assembly are almost in line from here. There must be some way of disabling or disarming the brute. Don't any of those projections unscrew?" "A couple of them look as if they ought to, but I've no spanners, and I lost the grips when I was snatched off." Moving forward again, he braced himself as well as he could, and tried to unscrew a graspable portion with his gloved hands. It was a waste of effort. He gave up and gazed ahead while he recovered his breath. The missile was steady on its course, with barely a tremor of correction to be felt. Distance was difficult to judge, but he guessed that he could not be much more than 20 miles from the hulk. Not many minutes. Ticker became aware of sweat forming on his forehead and stinging in the corners of his eyes. He shook his head and worked his eyebrows to try to get rid of the drops. Presently, he slithered clumsily back to the member connecting the port nacelle. He sat on it, lashing himself there as best he could with the lifeline. He pressed back on the main body, bracing his feet against the nacelle itself. He drew the 2 hand tubes, his own and Dobbin's. He checked their power settings, and then held them on either side of him, their wide mouths pointing outwards, their butts firmly grounded against the metal casing at his back. Like that, he waited. "Ticker, bail out now," said the commander. "I told you, Skip. I'm not for dying slowly in a spacesuit." The hulk and the assembly beyond it seemed to be rushing towards him now. His spine was prickling, partly with sweat, partly with the knowledge of the explosive just behind it. He found himself becoming more conscious of it, crawlingly aware of the vast, tearing power held in a thin shell, waiting for the impact that would release it. The sweat ran out of every pore, soaking his clothes. He sat with his head turned to the right, watching the hulk grow bigger and nearer from eyes that stung with salt. "Not too soon," he told himself. "It mustn't be too soon." But it mustn't be too late either. He was aware of the commander's voice in the phone again, but he took no notice of it. Would 1 mile distance do? Or would that not be soon enough? No. It should give him just time enough at the rate he was going. He would make it 1 mile as near as he could judge. He went on watching, both hands clenched on the tube grips. Must be about a couple of miles now. He set his teeth and pulled both triggers right back for a moment. The hulk seemed to slide to the left as the missile kicked over more sharply than he had expected. The thing keeled for a moment, like a dancer caught off balance. Then, the steering tubes fired a correcting blast. The nose swung back onto the target, and then beyond it. The tubes on the near side fired to correct the overswing. At the same moment, Ticker pulled both triggers back and held them there. With the combined blast reinforcing her new backswing, the missile leapt sideways and swung broadside to her course at the same time. The constellations whirled round Ticker's head. He looked wildly round for the hulk and found it back over his left shoulder, and not much more than half a mile away. He prayed that there was not time enough for a correction. An air missile, with air to grip and fins to grip it, might have managed a quick correction, but in space, where every movement is a delicate matter of thrust and counter-thrust, time, too, is a highly important factor. Oscillation cannot be killed at a stroke. Lost equilibrium cannot be regained in a moment. The angle of diversion needed to get back on course grew more acute every second. Ticker knew suddenly that the thing could not do it. Only the main drive could have exerted enough force to jump it back in time to hit, and experience showed that the main drive liked to be steady in the aim before it fired. But the side tubes tried. Ticker braced himself where he sat while the heavens reeled as the missile spun. Then the hulk rushed past in a blur, 50 yards away.
"Done it! By God! Bloody good show, Ticker," said a voice. "Quiet there," snapped the commander. "Ticker, that was magnificent. Now come off it. Bail out quick."
Ticker, still held by his line, relaxed, feeling all in. The missile, still swinging from side to side, scudded on with him into space.
"Ticker, do you hear me? Bail out," repeated the commander.
Ticker said wearily, "I hear you, Skip. But there won't be enough power left in these tubes to get me back to you."
"Never mind. Use what there is as a brake. We'll fetch you in, but get clear of it now."
There was a pause. Ticker's tired voice said, "Sorry, Skip, but we don't know what this bastard's going to do next, do we?"
"For heaven's sake, man."
"Sorry, Skip. Mutiny, I'm afraid." Ticker rested as he was, with his eyes closed. The sight of the constellation swooping to the missile's swings was making him feel sick. He was tired out. His head ached badly. He was soaked through with sweat. It was an effort to think. He sat as he was until he became aware that the pull on the line that held him in place had changed and become constant. He opened his eyes and found himself looking full at the moon. It was sliding slowly leftwards, and the great curve of the earth was rising on his right. "She's going about again," he said drearily. "I wonder if these bastards ever run out of fuel." Looking down, he found that he was still gripping the hand tubes. He let them go and float on their safety cords while his gloved hands fumbled at the knot of the line which held him. He managed to slacken it off and dragged himself back onto the main body again. The thing was fairly steady once more, with the starboard tubes firing now and then to turn it. There could be little doubt that it was in the process of coming round for yet another attack. He pulled himself forward onto the nose again and sat astride of it, holding on to the projecting knobs. Perched there, and summoning up his strength, he looked about him. Under his left foot lay the pearl-like earth, with the night shadow beginning to creep across her. The sun blazed high to his right. Up to the left, the pallid moon lay in a bed of jet, scattered with diamond dust. Lower to his left, but sliding slowly round towards the front, floated the hulk and the glittering spiderwork of girders that would one day be the space station. Once more he turned his eyes down to the great globe creeping past his left foot. He watched it steadily for some moments. Then he lifted his right hand and turned the air supply up a little. "Skipper?" he inquired.
"Receiving you, Ticker," acknowledged the commander. "We've just managed to get the glass on you. What the hell do you think you're doing?"
"I'm going to have a shot at disabling the thing, Skip. I think the line is to have a bash at this short, thick rod thing in front of me. Can you see it?"
"Yes, I can see it. Might be anything. You're satisfied it's part of the radar gear?"
"Obvious, Skipper."
"Ticker, you're lying. Leave it alone."
"I might be able to dent it a bit. Enough to mess it up."
"Ticker,
I know what I'm doing, Skip. Here goes." Ticker hooked his toes under two of the projections and gripped with his knees for the best possible purchase. He took up the hand tubes, one in each hand, and slammed away at the short, thick rod with all his might. Presently he paused, panting. No damned weight. Like hitting with matchsticks, he complained. Not a mark on it. He turned the air on a little more and screwed up his eyes to squeeze the sweat out of them. The missile was still coming round in its big curve. 20 degrees more would bring it onto the line of attack again. Going to try another of them this time, he said, lifting the tubes once more. Through the telescope, the commander watched him start to belabor one of the more slender projections. From the right, from the left, from the right, from the... There was a flash so brilliant that it stung his eyes. That was all. A vivid, silent flash shining for its brief moment as brightly as the sun. Then, where it had been, the glass showed nothing but empty darkness, with small, uncaring stars, thousands of light years beyond. The air marshal spread the message on his desk and studied it for several long, thoughtful moments. His mind went back to the night 50 years ago when the other ticker had not come back. The same job for grandson as for grandfather, only it had been easier the first time, with a war on and the news half expected. He felt old. He was old. Too old, perhaps. If they had not changed the regulations, he would have been on the shelf 10 years ago at his age. Still, here he was. And he'd tell her himself. Tell this poor girl, just as he had told the other one long ago, so piteously little he could tell her, lost on a secret mission, so cruelly blank. She would know later on, of course, when security considered it safe. Oh yes, she would know. He'd see to that. He would throw all his weight there, for sheer cold courage, nothing less than a VC. Nothing less. He looked back at the security report for the previous day. Subject dispatched radio to Troon. Message, Happy birthday, from Laura and Michael. Nota bene, presumed code reference to the subject's birth of child, male, on previous evening. Supporting this, A, Troon's birthday, 8th of May. B, his radio reply, I love you both. The air marshal sighed and shook his head. But at least she has the boy, he murmured. And she knows he knew about the boy. I'm glad he did. The old ticker never even knew there was to be a child. I hope they meet up there. Ought to get on well together.